such as the committee requested on June 4th, 2024.
From the Office of the Auditor General, Karen Hogan, Auditor General Canada; Andrew Hayes, Deputy Auditor General; Mathieu Lequin, Principal; and Eva Jarzina, Director. And from the Department of Industry, Simon Kennedy, Deputy Minister, good to see you, as well as Francis Bilodeau, Associate Deputy Minister, Innovation, Science and Economic Development, Canada. Appreciate seeing you as well today. Each of you will have, each group will have a 5-minute opening statement. And as for our customs, we'll begin with you, Ms. Hogan, for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to discuss our report on Sustainable Development Technology Canada. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. This audit examined whether the Foundation, Sustainable Development Technology Canada, managed public funds in accordance with the terms and conditions of contribution agreements and its legislative mandate. It also examined Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada's oversight and administration of public funds. Between March 2017 and December 2023, the Foundation approved $856 million of funding to 420 projects. We found that there were significant lapses in Sustainable Development Technology Canada's governance and stewardship of public funds. Specifically, the Foundation awarded $59 million to 10 projects that did not meet key requirements set out in the contribution agreements between the government and the Foundation. I am also very concerned by breakdowns in the Foundation's governance. The Foundation was not always following its conflict of interest policies, and it failed to comply with the Canada Foundation for Sustainable Development Technology Act. The Act requires the Foundation to have a group of 15 members, separate from its board of directors, to represent Canadians and appoint most of the Foundation's board. We found that the Foundation did not comply with the legislation because it had only 2 such members instead of the required 15. En ce qui concerne les conflits,
with respect to conflicts of interest, the Foundation did not have an effective system to maintain its conflict of interest disclosures and related actions. Although we found 96 cases where directors had followed the conflict of interest policy by declaring their conflicts and appropriately recusing themselves during voting, there were 90 cases where the Foundation's records show that conflict of interest policies were not followed. These 90 cases were connected to approval decisions that awarded projects nearly $76 million in funding. We also found that Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada did not sufficiently assess whether the Foundation complied with contribution agreements. Through its limited monitoring activities, the department could not ensure the funds were spent according to requirements in contribution agreements. In addition, the department did not carry out compliance audits of the Foundation and it did not monitor conflicts of interest. Like all organizations funded by Canadian taxpayers, Sustainable Development Technology Canada has a responsibility to conduct its business in a manner that is transparent, accountable, and compliant with legislation. Our findings show that when this doesn't happen, it's not always clear that funding decisions made on behalf of Canadian taxpayers were appropriate and justified. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening statement. We would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
And
we thank you once again.
I expect you'll be making the presentation for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks for the invitation to appear before the committee today, Mr. Chair, and for allowing me to provide some opening remarks with regard to the audit of SDTC.
There are 3 points that I'd like to put to the members of the committee.
Department's commitment to sound management of public funding. We aim to ensure effective stewardship in all of our activities, and where weaknesses are found, to take swift action to correct those weaknesses. The record shows that Innovation, Science, and Economic Development moved swiftly as soon as we were made aware of the allegations of mismanagement by SDTC. We were informed by the whistleblower of the allegations in mid-February 2023. Very shortly thereafter, we issued a contract for a leading audit firm, Raymond Chabot Grant Thornton, to conduct a fact-finding exercise. The firm had full access to the evidence provided by the whistleblower. RCGT's report was presented to the department in late September 2023. It revealed inconsistencies and opportunities for improvement in the organization's governance and conflict of interest practices, its compliance with its contribution agreement, and in HR practices. Within a few short days, the minister was briefed and he ordered SDTC to implement a detailed corrective action plan in order to pause on new project funding. En réponse aux préoccupations concernant les pratiques de ressources humaines,
in response to human resources practices that were of concern at SDTC, I said worked to establish a second review.
The government engaged a leading national law firm, McCarthy Tétrault, to look deeply into the allegations around HR practices. That review was thorough, interviewing more than 60 current and former SDTC staff, executives, and board members, and an associated document review. ICE had also provided to the law firm the package we received from the whistleblower. This review found that neither current nor former executives engaged in harassment, that severance packages and NDAs were aligned with normal business practices, and that HR complaints were unequivocally addressed. Finally, of course, the Auditor General conducted her own audit. We've been very pleased to work closely with Ms. Hogan in her office, and we welcome the findings of her audit. We are in full agreement with her findings, including the recommendations directed to ICED, and indeed we're already quite advanced on implementing improvements. My second point is to underline the unique nature of SDTC. Its legal structure played a role in both how we got here today and in the government's plans for restoring funding to the clean tech sector. Parliament more than 20 years ago set up this organization as a private foundation. This means an organization in the private sector, not owned by the government. The statute makes clear that SDTC is not an agent of the Crown. In this regard, it is totally unlike a branch of my department or a Crown corporation or even a third party that might act as our agent to deliver a program on our behalf. Through a contribution agreement, ICED allocated funds to SDTC for a specific purpose, but much of the decision-making day-to-day as to how the organization should operate and exactly how its programming should work are, by design, in the hands of the SDTC board and management team. En vertu de la loi, la capacité du gouvernement.
Under the legislation, the government's ability to supervise the activities of this organization is limited to the terms of the contribution agreement. All issues regarding human resources, for example, completely are not under the supervision of the government. Employees are not civil servants, and even before McCarthy Tétrault was able to launch its examination,
activities under the contribution agreement, but as the Auditor General said, these were not sufficient to pick up the problems inside SDTC. We agree and are already well advanced in putting in place structural changes in how we oversee clean tech funding. My final point, briefly, is with regard to the action plan to restore confidence in clean tech funding. We are confident the transition of both rank-and-file staff and SDTC programming to the NRC will directly address the concerns that have arisen through the various reviews. First of all, the NRC and the IRAP program have a 100-year history of excellence in delivering programming to Canadian business. Moreover, they have expertise in clean tech. They are well suited to take on the new responsibilities. Moreover, unlike SDTC, the NRC is a Crown agency. It is fully subject to important statutes such as the Financial Administration Act. Its employees are public servants directly accountable to the Crown. Its governing council in its entirety is named by the government. The president of the NRC is a GIPC appointee subject to regular performance reviews by the government. The challenges identified at SDTC revolved almost entirely around its arm's-length independent governance model, which clearly, as the minister has said, was not sufficient to meet modern expectations of public sector governance. By placing its programming inside the public service, the ability to scrutinize and ensure adherence to key government policies, whether in finance, administration, conflict of interest, or HR, will be much higher. Monsieur le Président, merci de m'avoir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present these remarks. I'm now available to answer questions by members. Thank you very much.
Each of the first four members will have 6 minutes each. Mr. Barrett, you have the first slot.
Ms. Hogan, we got a shocking response to a question from my colleague, Mr. Perkins, from your office. Are you able to confirm that the total amount of money that was handed out by SDTC in cases of conflicts of interest is more than $250 million? It's $336 million.
So I'd like to just provide a bit of clarity to the figures. So there were 96 cases of conflict of interest that we believed were managed well, where board members recused themselves from the vote. Those were linked to $259 million of funding. Then there were 90 cases, as we noted in the audit, where there was conflict of interest that were not properly managed, where individuals who had declared a conflict of interest continued to be involved in the discussion and then vote. Those were linked to $76 million of funding. Why you can't just add the two up is some of the funding appears in both buckets. So it isn't just a case of adding the two numbers, but it represents a total $319 million.
$319 million in the cases of the conflicts of interest. Thank you very much. Mr. Kennedy, when was the minister or his staff first informed about any of the findings of the RCGT report? The date, please, sir.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm looking at the chronology here. The minister was briefed on the results of the fact-finding exercise and the next steps on the 27th of September, 2023. And there's a briefing note that would have been, my office would have provided him to support that discussion.
So, prior to end September, you never discussed any findings at any stage of the RCGT report with the minister or his staff before that formal briefing at the end of September?
I spoke, so Mr. Chair, we received the confidential file from the complainant on the 16th of February. We briefed the minister shortly thereafter on the fact that we had received this binder and of the proposal to conduct this review using a third-party audit firm. Then the review kind of unfolded between sort of early March and late September, when the minister was briefed on the findings in late September on the date that I noted. But certainly I would have let him know the review was continuing and so on. You know, I meet the minister regularly, so I would have maybe orally let him know that the RCGT was continuing its work. But the briefing on the findings, Mr. Chair, was the 27th of September, 2023.
You know, we heard from your CFO that there were multiple discussions in June, and then prior to the September date, that the minister was read in on it. So you agree with Mr. McConaughey's statements that the minister had been read in on the status of the RCGT report, not at the end of September, but in fact in June?
I would have, as part of normal practice, kept the minister apprised of the fact that the audit work was continuing. We had, and again, I believe this is a matter of record, but we had received a preliminary assessment from RCGT on their work, and we actually amended the contract for them to do additional field work. That was in early June. So there were kind of multiple rounds with RCGT right, where we asked them to go back and do additional work. But as I say, the results were presented to the minister on the 27th of September.
On the 15th of September, SDTC says that you told them there would be no further investigation and they should consider suspending funding. So you made the decision on the 15th prior to briefing the minister in full to that effect. That wasn't the minister's call, that was yours?
There were a couple of, there are two things, Mr. Chair, I think happening here at the same time. One is that there's the work that RCGT was doing and the dates I've noted, Mr. Chair. And the second was SDTC, the way they normally operate, this is my layperson's description, they have a kind of a regular funding cycle where they do reviews of projects and they make funding awards. When I spoke to the organization, I advised them that it would be unwise to kind of continue business as usual. So
that was your decision?
Well, it was really SDTC's decision to kind of suspend. At this point, the minister hadn't issued a formal stop order, but it was advice that they have a board meeting coming, and it's like you may wish to delay decision-making because the audit report is almost final. Okay. We'll be talking to the minister, and
so,
you
so
don't want
running short on time, sir.
Sorry.
The findings were produced by RCGT in May. The study was extended. Did you make that decision, or did the minister make the decision?
That would have been made by me. It would have been the department's decision to extend that.
So the findings were enough for ISED to discuss an action plan, including a new office of a director general level to deal with it, but that never materialized. Who made the decision, and on what date was the decision to extend? Because you didn't brief the minister, you said, until June. These seem like pretty advanced decisions for the minister to not weigh in on.
I'm not sure, Mr. Chair, I understand. I'll try to answer. We had RCGT doing audit work. The audit work clearly, picked up that there might be issues. We wanted them to do additional field work so we would know, we would have a definitive assessment to present to the government. When we were getting closer to the final report being ready for presentation to the government, we also were working on our management response and action plan, which I can make available to the committee. I believe it's a matter of public record, but that was the actual response to the audit. What would we do in response to these findings that were problematic?
Thank you very much. Up next is Ms. Shanahan for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today, in particular the Auditor General, again, for an excellent report. And I am glad to see that that the department is moving forward on the recommendations and is cooperating in every way on this matter. But what concerns me is the highly unusual, I would say, for this committee letter that we received from the Auditor General on the 10th of June. And it concerns the motion that was passed in the House of Commons the week before regarding the production of documents and indeed the entire audit file that is housed by the Office of the Auditor General. And in the letter, Auditor General, you express your concern about some of the short-term and long-term impacts of this motion and how producing this entire audit file to the law clerk and parliamentary council compromises your independence, I'm paraphrasing here, of course, and is likely to discourage departments, agencies, and Crown corporations from providing you, your office, with free and timely access to the information required for audits going forward. And indeed, this concerns me greatly as a member of this committee, because the independence and the integrity of the Office of the Auditor General is of paramount importance. So I'd like to ask, Chair, through you, the Auditor General, if you can explain the background of the letter you sent to this committee last week in regard to the House motion and your investigation at SDTC, and why do you feel it's important to voice your concern at this time, and can you please explain further your thinking behind this?
So at the time of my letter, it was before it was amended. The original motion had been amended. I think it's important just in the timeframes to know that. I believed that including my office in that motion was unnecessary, since inserting the law clerk didn't seem to be something that was needed in order to see my office comply with a request from Parliament. We have always cooperated very swiftly with Parliament, and that I already had established mechanisms in place in order to ensure that the RCMP could access any information that they believed was necessary in the course of an investigation that they might undertake. When it comes to my independence and the long-term impacts that I think this might have on audits, I think Parliament believed that my audit files should be protected. And they signaled that by shielding them in the Auditor General Act from access to information and privacy requests. And this was something that was done in the context of the Federal Accountability Act, that it was important that information that we gather be able to be protected in some fashion, that it was also done to ensure that public servants or any other individual who wished to talk to us could provide us with free and timely access to information. And my concern by being included in this motion was that that might hinder my ability to gain timely access to information going forward, or really the freedom that public servants feel now, and that when they talk to us, what they say will remain confidential, and then will appear in our report in the best way possible to help Parliament hold the government to account. So I was concerned about that. I was also then concerned about the time and the cost it might take to respond to such a request. It was unclear to me at the time whether my entire file needed to be translated in order to meet this motion. So there was many things that were causing some concern, but as soon as the motion passed in the House, we communicated that day with the law clerk, and we're working through how to ensure that we continue to support Parliament as we always have.
Well, thank you very much for that answer, and I think that we can certainly rely on the professionalism of your office and the other offices in Parliament. But more and more we're seeing, for a variety of reasons, this push to divulge all information, just sort of regardless of where it comes from, what it's used for, what its purpose is. And so I'd like to hear from you. Do you believe that this type of motion, and who knows what could come up in the future, could affect the integrity of future investigations that you're conducting? Would this have a chill effect, in other words?
Well, as I mentioned, I guess I'm concerned about the unintended consequences that the motion may have on my access, free and unfettered access from public servants and Crown corporations and departments and agencies going forward. If there's belief that everything might need to get handed over, there might be hesitancy to provide us with information. Or we might have to deal with redactions, and then the time that it takes to challenge departments and have those appropriately removed or not removed. So I think there might be some unintended consequences that I hope will not impact going forward, but those cause delays, and delays are such that I might not be able to provide all reports in a timely fashion to Parliament, as I have committed to do. So.
Thank you. I'm afraid that is your time, unfortunately, Ms. Shanahan. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Ms. Sinclair Desgagnés for 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for their appearance, and I thank the Auditor General and her team for a very interesting report. Sustainable Development Technology Canada. It has noble intentions. It's lasted for 23 years, and it's become a management disaster. And anxiety for the thousands of entrepreneurs who develop and depend on these technologies that are essential for the future of Canada. Madam Auditor General, I'd have a brief question for you first. Simply, I want to understand the chronology of events. In November 2022, whistleblowers contacted your office. Is that correct? Yes, that was in November. Okay. And then what you advised, that these whistleblowers present this evidence to the Privy Council office, correct? Well, we contacted the PCO ourselves. At what point did you contact the PCO? In February 2023. Okay. So in February, you contacted the Privy Council office. All right. Now, I'm turning now to Mr. Kennedy. What happened for you between November and March, or rather June, when you gave a mandate to Raymond Chabot? There were 17 months between those two events. Why did you wait so long? Well, Mr. Chairman, my understanding is that the people who were concerned with these problems went to various organizations, the Auditor General, the PCO. We received the complaints on February 16th. So our engagement in this file was rather February rather than November. And we decided that because this is an organization that received funds from us, it was in our portfolio, it was up to us to do follow-up. So for those reasons, we started this study with Raymond Chabot. Indeed, that's indeed up to you to do the necessary follow-up. I understand that for the Raymond Chabot, but then there was a succession of events. You told my colleague that you informed the minister. So you say that the minister was made aware of these issues when exactly? Well, Mr. Chairman, we formally informed the minister March 5th, saying we had received a complaint and we were considering an audit, and we issued the contract about 10 days later and presented the results of the audit to the minister on September 27th. So we discussed this with the minister in March, early March. So between 2001 and 2022, there was a lack of follow-up. If you look at the Auditor General's report, you were getting the minutes about conflict of interest. They were supposed to inform you when funding was recovered. There were all kinds of issues that the department should have been aware of and was not followed up on. Can you please just tell me who within Innovation, Science and Development was supposed to follow this? It's part of your portfolio, that's fine. So who within the department was supposed to do this follow-up for SDTC? Yes, there's a place in the department that's responsible for clean tech programs that engages with organizations like SDTC. It's up to us and finance to do follow-up with organizations like this, but it's up to the department to do follow-up with organizations. Okay, so 2 offices, twice rather than once, 2 different offices didn't do the appropriate follow-up to make sure that SDTC was using public funds properly. So access to the minutes was not verified. I have another piece of information, and I'm sure Canadians should know this. There was an internal audit in 2018. In the recommendations, they were already talking about reviewing conflict of interest policies and make sure that these policies were properly supervised by the department. And that was in 2018. That means that internal audit recommendations were already referring to these problems, but you're saying not just one team, but 2 teams within the department didn't do the necessary follow-up with SDTC. That's a problem. When was the decision made to demolish SDTC? This decision must have been made far ahead of time. When was it made, please? I think, Mr. Chairman, I would note, obviously, we do work on different options. We knew that the Auditor General was doing an audit and presenting her results. We did a review with Raymond Chabot that showed that there were problems. So we were thinking about different options. Was it to strengthen the board of directors, change governance? That was a discussion that took place for many months. I don't have exactly the date the decision was made in front of me, but the minister announced the decision the same day the report was tabled. But the minister didn't pull this out of a hat. A decision was made ahead of time. Yes, certainly, Mr. Chairman. That was a lot of work that had to be done. Could you give me a date or a week, perhaps? I don't have the date in front of me, Mr. Chairman, but I just want to note that we did a lot of work to arrive at that announcement. Okay, thank you very much. Next.
Joining us online for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the Auditor General and their team for a very important audit related to Sustainable Development Technology Canada, where I think you kind of highlighted in speaking to the Auditor General, your opening remarks on some of the key issues that pertain to the, I think, very troubling concerns that Canadians are now faced with. Part of them, if I may summarize, and I'll also editorialize a bit, but I'll give you an opportunity to speak about this afterwards. In terms of my summary of this issue, related one to non-compliance of the Act, you were pretty clear about that there was non-compliance with the Establishing Act, which would provide some level of oversight, at least to try to prevent some of the egregious issues we're seeing here today. Conflict of interest. It was mentioned by my colleagues just now several times. There's been criticism related to the conflict of interest issues related to this fund. Abuse of workers. It's my understanding that non-unionized workers were forced to report this as whistleblowers, ultimately facing some of the most severe setbacks in one's life, like losing your job and the issues that pertain to personal life for doing that. So I thank those whistleblowers for their immense courage in bringing forward a very serious issue. Unfortunately, they were non-unionized, and many of them suffered the penalties of such. This would be a good example as to why unions are important. And ultimately to Canadians, and particularly young Canadians who are hoping for a government that actually takes seriously the concerns of climate change. And what they find here is a classic example of greenwashing. It breaks my heart, and I think the hearts of many Canadians, to know that they have a very difficult circumstance we found ourselves in, with this promise to help challenge the climate crisis that we're all in today, but yet one of the major tools of the government to help with sustainable development and technology has largely been hijacked by large-scale issues like conflict of interest, which leads to corruption. It's disappointing, and I think to the Deputy Minister, this is something that I hope you can take full breath of, not just in today's hearing, but as the report continues, to understand how not only is this an abuse of taxpayer dollars and the important funds that people work so hard to contribute to our government, but also a massive breach in trust. Basic level trust in our institutions, a basic level trust in the programs that are said to be adhered to by government. And when they see reports like this, I think it dramatically, and it cannot be understated, the direct damage it does to public confidence. And that's something that you have to take forward in your responsibility as our Deputy Minister, and one I hope you take seriously. I do now want to turn to one of the issues that I highlighted in my opening remarks related to the very serious issues of governance and non-compliance to the Act. The Auditor General makes special note of the appointment process for the Board of Directors, and the fact that there was a requirement under the Act to have 15 boards of Board of Directors, and we found ourselves in a situation where there was only 2 to the Auditor General. How is that possible? How did that happen?
So if I may, Mr. Chair, just a bit of a point of clarification. The Board of Directors had 15 members. It's this group of members, I'll call them a member council, that's not their official title, who were put in place to ensure that, to name half of the board, but then also to do certain things like name the external auditors. It was that group of members that dwindled down to 2. And this is where I believe the Board of Directors of the Foundation failed in ensuring that the Foundation would continue to comply with its enabling legislation, which required not only the board to have 15 members, but the member council to also have 15 members.
Who's responsible for monitoring compliance of the Act?
In my view, that is the responsibility of the Board of Directors of the Foundation to ensure that they comply with the Act. Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada were to ensure that the Foundation complied with the contribution agreements between the government and the Foundation, but their oversight could have also included ensuring that the Foundation was complying with legislation.
In your mind, where do you think the biggest error in governance comes from? Is it, and I want to summarize that question with this feeling I get of this pattern, being on public accounts now almost 3 years. Ms. Hogan, you've presented us with many reports, and I thank you for that. But I think in your own mind as well, you would see that there's this troubling pattern, this pattern that continues to persist of ministries and departments and partners just skirting the line of their accountability or their responsibility just enough that there isn't really one person or one department or one ministry that we can hold accountable. And I think that's an issue that leads to me to think that we have an issue in coordination or oversight or accountability. Can you please spend a bit of time just describing who is most accountable for this work?
I think here the biggest accountability rests in my mind with the board of directors of the foundation. They had a fiduciary responsibility to the foundation, and in my view, they failed to ensure that conflicts of interest were well managed and that they complied with legal requirements. I think most concerning was that this group of members was allowed to dwindle to 2 individuals instead of 15, and that they then appointed 5 members to the board of directors. That to me was a huge gap in governance around this foundation and compliance with its enabling legislation. I do believe finally that the department plays some role in oversight, but I think ultimately this failure rests with the board of directors of the foundation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Beginning our second round, Mr. Baird, I understand you're going to begin and turn things over to one of your colleagues. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
So I just wanted to take a second to circle back to one of the questions from the previous round, Madam Auditor General, with respect to files that have been ordered by the House to be transmitted by the law clerk to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Now, this is, I think that function, first of all, is important to highlight, that's the law clerk's role here, is to serve as the conduit for those files to make that travel. This isn't a direction to the Auditor General on what to audit. It's like any bill that comes through the House that receives a majority support. The documents and data that were used by you to reach the conclusions that you did with respect to millions of dollars. We had 336. Sorry, I think you said $319 million was the number involved in cases of conflict of interest. Some were declared, some were undeclared, but all of that money went to appointees' interests that were involved with SDTC. The only reason that this step is necessary is because after 9 years of the NDP Liberal government, we have complete absence of transparency, a refusal to be transparent with Canadians. And it's not just files from the Auditor General. Of course, we need files from Sustainable Development Technology Canada, but also files from ISED. And so our hope is that, we know that the record keeping at the Auditor General's office is excellent. We haven't seen that evidenced by the departments that you've audited. So my question, Mr. Kennedy, is are you collecting documents and prepared to transmit them to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police?
Mr. Chair, I can certainly confirm we are doing that, and we are moving expeditiously to do that.
Mr. Perkins, you've got just over 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions for the Auditor General. Thank you for your report on sustainable development technologies that was released last week. Better known colloquial to those who are watching as the Liberal Green Slush Fund. 186 transactions approved by the board were approved by directors who had a conflict of some sort, declared, undeclared, maybe didn't follow the conflict of interest guidelines, correct?
I wouldn't say it's 186 transactions. Sometimes there may have been many conflicts for one transaction. That's why we said it was 96 cases and 90 cases.
Those
it doesn't mean
cases.
90 different projects.
Okay. So
I don't know if that helps you understand.
So it's not 186 out of 420 projects you reviewed?
No, the cases of conflict of interest, there could be many conflicts of interest with one project.
I can see why Canadians and everyone is confused about this, because it appears that even the department and the government, who had an ADM in the meeting every time, didn't clearly understand. And that totals, as you said, 319 million of 820 million? 856 million. Yes. Sorry, 856 million, which is about 40, somewhere around 40% of the money allocated in the period you audited was conflicted in some way.
Yes, there was a conflict of interest, either well managed or not well managed, linked
Correct.
to the funding decision.
Correct,
Yes.
thank you. And in addition to that, there was another 58 million. I don't know if maybe there was overlap. Another 58 million that in the fund that did not meet the contribution agreements, which included, I believe, the COVID payments.
Yeah, that 58 million was funding that didn't follow the process outlined in the contribution agreement, where it should have been project by project based on merit. These were really these batch approvals that should
And they
not
only
have-
get the $1 billion. These Liberal appointees only got the $1 billion in order to follow the contribution agreement. They didn't have freedom to go outside the contribution agreements.
The contribution agreement was supposed to dictate how funding decisions were
Right.
made and where the money went.
Right,
yes.
so they went outside of that. So there's 319 million conflicted, another 58 million that went outside the contribution agreements. So almost $400 million of $859 million of this board approval, these Liberal appointees, were not complying generally with either normal governance practices in not doing business with the company that you are governing, or outside of the rules that Parliament and ISED set up for the organization in allocating the $1 billion for them to invest.
If I may, the funds, there will be some overlap again. That 58 million, some of it is already included in those that have conflicts of interest. I can ask the team to try and narrow down for you. We might not get to it through the meeting, but if we can, we'll give you the right number.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Up next and joining us virtually is Mr. Weiler. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I do also want to thank the witnesses for being here today, and the Auditor General and her office for their important work on this file, and for attending our committee in back-to-back weeks. But today I would like to direct my questions to Mr. Kennedy. As has been mentioned earlier, the AG has found many instances where projects didn't meet eligibility criteria, or where conflict of interest guidelines weren't followed. Could you please explain to this committee why SDTC is being brought under the wing of the NRC, and what assurances you can give us about accountability and transparency with SDTC being under NRC to prevent ineligible projects from being funded, or from conflict of interest guidelines not being followed?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Maybe I could speak briefly to the issue of conflict of interest. I think it is abundantly clear that processes and procedures were not followed in the diligent way they needed to be by the board in exercising its responsibilities. One of the things about and I don't have the legislation directly, well, I do now, but just to note that the statute itself, this is a statute passed by Parliament 20-something years ago, actually mandates that the board of directors be comprised of people, and this is my layperson's explanation, with expertise in the clean tech industry. It actually mandates that the people brought onto the board are people that have a background in the industry. So by the very structure set out in the legislation, you have this potential kind of inherent for conflict. And I haven't looked, but my suspicion is that kind of inherent risk has been there from day one, you know, through changes in government and so on, because you have a board who's called to be composed of people from the industry. That makes management of conflicts like a lot more important than it might otherwise be, because the risk of conflicts is going to be much more present if you're bringing people in with industry experience. And so I think by bringing this organization under the ambit of the NRC, you actually largely eliminate that problem. It's not that there's not going to be the possibility that a civil servant working at the National Research Council or someone in the chain of command is going to have a conflict. And in fact, there are pretty serious rules that public servants like myself have to follow to manage conflict. But you're not going to have potentially the kind of magnified risk of having a board involved in decision-making whose very background is in the industry where they're being asked to make funding decisions. So right out of the gate, I would give you that as a really vivid example where we think the risks would go down quite substantially around things like conflict of interest. I'm happy to elaborate further. I hope that, I mean, I could do that if you wish, but hopefully that gives you a sense of one of the big changes that would happen by bringing it in-house under the National Research Council.
No, that's very helpful. And is there going to be, are there going to be the current NRC ethics guidelines, or are there going to be new or enhanced guidelines that will need to be followed?
I think, Mr. Chair, I would might suggest that question be directed more specifically to the President of the NRC. I know he's been asked to testify. I would say that in our discussions with the government around, how to, basically get trust restored in clean tech funding. Part of the rationale for selecting the NRC is because of its very, very solid business processes. The IRAP program, I hope members will agree, is generally regarded as a very well-run program, very strongly supported by the business sector. And for the reasons I enumerated in my opening remarks, the NRC is a Crown it's a Crown agency. The individuals are subject to the Public Service, Code of Ethics. They're subject to the kinds of post-employment rules. The organization is governed by a council selected directly by the government. There was discussion earlier of the member council of SDTC. I would just give you this by way of illustration. Completely agree with the Auditor General about the necessity of ISED having stronger oversight of its contribution agreement. There's no quarrel there. But from a legal point of view, actually, ISED and the government have no ability to appoint members to the member council of SDTC. When this organization was set up, there was an initial round of appointments as members of the organization. That was meant to be self-perpetuating. The members appoint new members. So the fact that the membership was allowed to erode, there's no actual legal way for a minister of the Crown to go in and directly remedy that. That is totally different, for example, from the NRC, where if the number of members is allowed to decline, that is directly on the minister responsible. That's the minister and the governor and council's job to be appointing people to the NRC. SDTC, again, fully agreeing with the Auditor General about the necessity of ISED, strengthening its oversight, from a legal point of view, is actually quite far removed from the government, and many of the day-to-day decisions and many of the elements of governance are actually in the hands of the board of directors. That doesn't remove our responsibility to be perfectly clear, but it does create certain limits and practical issues. Many of those go away by moving the organization under the National Research Council.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnes.
Next, Madame Sinclair Desgagnes for 2.5 minutes. Madam Auditor General, has it happened often in your career that the organization you audited is abolished the day you table your report? No, I must admit that's the first time. Okay. That's... You had provided many recommendations, so it's quite radical as a measure, simply to abolish a fund and saying the activities will come under another part of government. Yes, that's a political decision. In my opinion, given all the deficiencies I raised are addressed, once the funds are in the public service, I'll be happy. Okay, that's exactly where I was going with this. So, Mr. Kennedy, how can we ensure that all the AG's reports that were accepted, considering the decision has already been made to abolish SDTC, how are you going to ensure that these problems won't simply follow these funds and the staff? Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important to note that when we got Raymond Chabot's results, we prepared a report, a response, and we insisted that the SDTC management put that action plan in place. I can't speak for the Auditor General, that it's my understanding that certain elements of this action plan touch on many of the Auditor General's concern. There are many things to be done, a lot of things concerning ISED, but we're advanced enough in the decision that was made to put in place much more robust structures than we used to have. We've had a lot of renovation with the institution that exists now. The idea is to move this toward the National Research Council. Well, very quickly, I have a question. Many companies contacted me. Their funding was suspended. Can you tell them when their grants and funding that was promised will be available, please? Well, Mr. Chairman, I can confirm that we've already started the process to put this money in place for organizations. That's in course. I think that that's a good question. We should go immediately to the new chair of the council and have them move quickly, but we're already working with them to restart the process for these funds. We decided that our action plan that the minister put on the table means that all action is in place. We verified that they've made changes, and we're comfortable in going ahead with new funds. But in the final analysis, it's up to the new team, the new chair, that are responsible. There you go. Thank you very much.
Desjardins, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kennedy, are you familiar with the term greenwashing?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I've certainly have heard that before.
And you're likely aware then that part of its definition would be to claim to be on track to reduce a company or an asset's polluting emissions to net zero when no credible plan is actually in place, correct?
I think, Mr. Chair, it's fair to say that would be sort of one possible example. Yes, I agree with that.
And in the instance where the Auditor General states that there was projects that did not, or SDTC, as a matter of fact, did not establish targets for environmental benefits of projects, but required applicants to quantify benefits in their applications. And of the projects assessed by the Auditor General's office, 12 of the 18 projects did not meet their stated emissions reductions by at least half. That's a huge difference, wouldn't you say, Mr. Kennedy?
I would agree with the findings of the Auditor General, absolutely.
But would you then agree with both, if you're agreeing to both these terms, that in many ways the SDTC fund is an example, especially the failed projects, of greenwashing?
I think, Mr. Chair, this is something that we have to be following up on with the new management team at SDTC. I think it's important to know.
It's all good and well to think about what's going to be happening next. But, Mr. Kennedy, the purpose of this committee and the purpose of this audit and the purpose of this report is to make very clear the failures that have taken place here so that we can actually make sure it never happens again. I'm looking for your clear advice on what is to me a very obvious and explicit example of greenwashing in a government program that has taken billions of dollars, funneled it into the hands of those who said that they would reduce emissions, and we see that a majority of projects that were examined failed to do that. Mr. Kennedy, is this, again, a very clear response I'll need from you, a good example of greenwashing within the government?
I think, Mr. Chair, what I would say would be we agree with the findings of the Auditor General. We agree that there needs to be enhanced oversight of the activities of SDTC, particularly with regards to adherence to the contribution agreement.
Is it greenwashing, Mr.
I think,
Kennedy,
Mr.
yes
Chair, I think I've given the answer I'm giving on this question.
To the Auditor General, do you think this is greenwashing?
I think what I would raise is that some of these projects were meant to fund innovation, which means it's about new technology that's never been tried before, and some of them will fail. But that's what innovation. That's what innovation's about.
Ms. Hogan, I think that's not the greatest response when a majority of the projects have failed to reduce at least half the emissions.
Thank you very much. I'm sure if you'd like to respond.
We only looked at the completed projects, 18. There were 58 of them that were part of the group, and we only looked at 18, so it would have really been 12 out of 58. But I take the point of the member.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's not working.
Thank you very much. Returning now to Mr. Perkins, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Deputy Kennedy, we've had testimony from many witnesses in this committee and 2 other committees, including from the former president of the Green Slush Fund, that there was an ADM in every board meeting where these votes were made. I believe for most of that time, certainly while you were deputy, that was now a retired public servant named Mr. Noseworthy. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Who has replaced Mr. Noseworthy in that role?
Mr. Chair, is it Charles?
Charles is IS.
Yeah.
Nobody specifically.
Mr. Chair, I'll have to get back to you on that because just to be clear for the member, this is an area we've been looking at deeply, and so work is underway to kind of renovate this role of the observer, and I'll have to get back to you with the details. But I'm happy to do that.
So during that time, and you said at the beginning that you take this, the department takes the management of these issues seriously, and that you, as the deputy, were only made aware of it when the whistleblower came to you, and that the board decisions don't remove at arm's length, don't remove your department's responsibility in the expenditure of taxpayer dollars. There are 186 instances, perhaps with some overlaps, where you had an assistant deputy minister in the meeting where conflicts were declared, were partially done, and he testified obtusely on those issues. Did he ever, as a person responsible for overseeing on behalf of this department, ever report to you about what was happening in the time that you were a deputy? Because I believe you were appointed in September 2019.
I think, Mr. Chair, what I would say would be on matters regarding the governance of the organization, the buck stops with the deputy minister. It's why I'm here speaking. I don't think I'm in a position to talk about what individual employees did or did not do, just as a kind of, frankly, basic matter of accountability and privacy. Okay. What I will say is we're in strong agreement with the Auditor General. And again, these are my words. I'm sorry, I don't have the report.
I understand that, Deputy. Yeah. So if I could ask you then, you were appointed 3 months after Mrs. Vacherian was put in charge as chair. Were you briefed that the president of SDTC had informed both the minister at that time, Navdeep Bains, and the ADM Noseworthy, who was going as a go-between, and the minister's office, that she had a conflict of interest and was not an appropriate appointment for chair?
I became aware of these concerns that had been raised contemporaneously with committee members. I was not deputy at the time and was not involved in those. No,
but when you took over as deputy only 3 months later and got briefed on this.
My awareness of these kind of historical events and the concerns raised, I learned about these, I would say, at more or less the same time that the committee did.
Okay, so on March 30th, 2021, SDTC Board Director Steve Kuchera had a project of which he had an equity interest in, approved by the board for $8 million. That's following, now that's in your time as chair, as deputy. That follows $4.5 million that his company had an equity interest in, received money from SDTC before you were deputy. So were you made aware by your officials that this director had received an $8 million equity investment in the company?
Mr. Chair, what I would say was I was made aware of these concerns around improper documentation of conflict of interest through the process, the whistleblower process, and the review by RCGT. That would have been, and had I been aware of these kinds of lapses, you could have been assured the organization would have been moving quickly to fix them. And I think the point that has been raised by the Auditor General, which was there was a range of activities undertaken, they weren't sufficient to catch them.
So when Andre Lise Miteau, who got $44 million in her time as director into companies she had an equity interest in 2021, received $3.5 million, and in November 2021, after she left the board to join the Infrastructure Bank board, in her cooling off period, her company received another $8.5 million. Did anyone inform you of that kind of corruption?
I am not, well, Mr. Chair, I was not aware of these activities.
Thank you very much. Up next, Ms. Khalid. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I feel like I'm very far away from you, which is a little heartbreaking. Thank you so much to our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Hogan, I'll start with you, if that's okay. I appreciated your letter, and it helped me to think about a lot of things and your role as the OAG. So perhaps I'll start with, what do you think the role of this Public Accounts Committee is within our democratic institutions?
I think one of the roles that I appreciate is that you receive all of my work, and you should be studying my work in order to hold government to account for the findings in that, and that this should be all about good stewardship of public funds and improving the public service regardless of any political color. It is the Public Accounts Committee is a wonderful committee that should be just focused on the outcome of better service to Canadians.
I appreciate that, and I feel exactly the same way. I think that's what is a should-be world, but we live in a what-is world, and I think that those two worlds are a little bit different. So perhaps I'll ask you, holding government to account, how does that correlate with people versus institutions, and kind of separating the two in terms of your report? I mean, the SDTC as an organization versus the people that are running it. How do you distinguish between those?
That's a complex question to answer. I think it depends on many factors. If I look at a government department, I think ultimately the deputy head is the accounting officer and is accountable for decisions that are made by the department. That being said, authorities are delegated in the public service, and I think every public servant who holds a delegated authority should appreciate what exercising that authority means. It comes with accountabilities and responsibilities. If I turn to an organization like a Crown or the foundation, which are at arm's length from the government, then the board of directors kicks in, and it is really the responsibility of the board of directors to ensure the good stewardship of the funds and the responsibilities to carry out the mandate of that organization.
I appreciate that. Mr. Kennedy, do you have anything to add to that?
No, Mr. Chair, I would agree with that.
Thank you. Ms. Hogan, over these past number of years, we've seen an increasing polarization, and I'm not sure what kind of role social media plays in it. I'm just wondering, has your office been impacted, with the work that you do with respect to very, very hyper-partisan politics that are being played with certain political parties, et cetera, in relation to your work?
I think social media impacts every organization. The misinformation or disinformation that might be out there, and I hope that Canadians can turn to information that my office provides to know that we are a trusted source of information, that the information that we provide is based on sound audit methodology, that it includes evidence to support the statements that we make. So I'm always concerned if our organization is just seen as another opinion there, when we should be a trusted opinion that Canadians and parliamentarians should be able to rely on.
You're absolutely right. I know that I give a lot of regards to all of your reports. I read them cover to cover and take a lot of positive feedback from what you have to say, because I do find you as an independent person overseeing what Parliament and what government is doing to be very, very credible. But we are seeing that there is a lot of manipulation of facts and a lot of disinformation that is being spread, especially by some parliamentarians, as to the work that you do. What can we do as a committee to prevent that, and how do we combat that level of disinformation? Because ultimately what it does is it really corrodes at our democratic institutions.
Well, I guess one of the things I think that specifically the Public Accounts Committee can do is that when you want to study some of my work, is to bring the entities that we audit to the table with us together. It's important when we're here together that you can hear all sides of the story, but it allows us to ensure that our work is properly understood, properly interpreted, and we're here really ultimately to support parliamentarians to hold government to account, and we should be doing that with them by our side.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Beginning our third round, Mr. Cooper, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hogan, you found in your report 186 cases of conflict, 96 cases where declarations of conflict were made, 90 cases where they were not by, in almost all cases, board members. Would you agree that in all of those cases where monies were funneled to companies of board members, and that was in the case of almost all of those conflicts, totaling nearly $319 million, that was in contravention of the Canada Foundation for Sustainable Development Technology Act?
Well, I would tell you that we found that the 90 cases that were not well managed didn't follow their own conflict of interest policies. I think what didn't follow the Sustainable Development Technology Act was how the member council dwindled down to 2, and those 2 members were able to appoint 5 board members. That is where the act was contravened. The rest was around not respecting the contribution agreement.
Well, I would just,
government.
through you, Mr. Chair, Section 12 sub 2 of the Act says that directors are not to profit, that no director shall profit or gain any income or require any property from the foundation or its activities, and yet $319 million was funneled into the companies in which board members had an interest, and that would seem to me, on the face of reading the Act, to be a violation of the Act.
I think, Mr. Chair, the member highlights an area where we noted in our report that the conflict of interest policy established by the Board of Directors of the Foundation did not comply with its act. Absolutely, the act was clear that an individual should not personally benefit, yet their policies were just provided for a blackout period. They were much less restrictive on the board members than they were on the employees of the Foundation.
Precisely. So they had a conflict policy that was inadequate insofar as it didn't necessarily meet up with the law, in terms of complying with the law.
With its, yes, you're correct in that instance. Yes.
Thank you for that. Mr. Kennedy, the Auditor General's report is a scathing indictment of ISED, the department that you help oversee as the Deputy Minister. Your department has a duty to oversee $1 billion taxpayers' dollars that was sent to SDTC. We now know that taxpayers were ripped off. Nearly $400 million out of $850 million that was spent by SDTC was improperly spent. $319 million in cases of conflicts of interest, $59 million in which there was non-compliance with contribution agreements. Canadian taxpayers deserve a refund, and they deserve a refund now. What instructions has the minister provided you to get taxpayers their money back?
I think, Mr. Chair, we have been working with the organization, partly through the Management Response and Action Plan, to look at all of the organizations that are receiving funding now and to, this is my layperson's language, but effectively kind of rescreen them and kind of put them, back through some sort of process to examine, whether or not there are problems, like whether or not some of the issues identified by the Auditor General, remain present. The organization's actually engaged a third party. They have a third-party audit firm that's helping with that. So we're effectively, to date, and this will be something that the new management team, the new board at SDTC
How much of the $400 million of taxpayers' money that was improperly spent is going to be recouped, and when?
I think, Mr. Chair, it is important to keep in mind what we're talking about here, because there are kind of multiple levels of issues that have been, surfaced by the various reviews and audits that have been undertaken. There are going to be cases where potentially funding was provided and it needs to be recovered. There are going to be other cases where organizations, private sector companies, in good faith, engage in a contractual relationship with SDTC, presuming that that what they were doing was in accordance with the rules, and may find themselves in a situation where actually...
Well, sir, the Auditor General found that there was $6.2 million, just a small a portion of the $400 million in projects that were canceled by STTC that your department had a responsibility to recover funds from, and your department didn't even do that.
I think, Mr. Chair, on the issue of recoveries, that's a separate issue. We will be taking action to offset funds owed in cases of recoveries. It is absolutely the case that where an organization has not, spent the money, or whether it's been spent improperly, there needs to be a recovery. That money should be returned to the Crown. I would agree entirely with the member on that point.
Thank you very much. Up next, Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for coming and answering our questions. Mr. Kennedy, in the beginning, the department initiated 2 separate independent reviews and also invited the Auditor General to conduct an audit. Why the 2 separate independent reviews, and how are each of those 2 reviews different?
Mr. Chair, I should just make sure the record's clear. I wouldn't want to speak for the Auditor General, but the Auditor General made an independent decision to conduct an audit. It was not at our invitation. I just want to make sure that nobody thinks that, much as we enjoy working with the Auditor General, that it was somehow at our behest that this was done. The reason for these 2 reviews are as follows. Under the legal structure that is SDTC and the kind of legal responsibilities that it has and that the Crown has, it is very easy for us to ask and indeed to follow up with audit work with regard to the contribution agreement. So this is the kind of contract we have with SDTC, which legally is this arm's length. It's not a government organization. It's a private organization at arm's length. And so the Raymond Chabot report looked at all of those issues related to, were they following the contribution agreement? Were they applying conflict of interest? Were they doing the sorts of things that frankly would be required by virtue of the of the contribution agreement? The Raymond Chabot report also made some observations about human resources, but you will note that in our management response and action plan, the character of what we have to say about HR is different than the other elements. And the reason for that is the human resources is actually legally the responsibility of the organization. It's legally the responsibility of the board. The Crown actually has no legal, these are not Crown employees. These are private sector employees working for a foundation. So we actually had to get agreement from the SDTC board to waive their rights, to allow the Attorney General to hire an agent to go in and do a review of HR. So obviously, given all of the allegations and given the pressure, the board was very cooperative, and they were certainly eager to allow the government to go in. But that was a separate process because, unlike with the contribution agreement, where we have full legal rights to kind of march in there and look around and demand documents, on the HR front, actually for the Crown to have taken action without the consent of the board and without sort of having all of its legal bases covered, that would have been actually ultra vires. It would have, I'm not a lawyer, but there's no legal grounds for the government to do that. And in fact, could attract quite a bit of liability and from employees and managers and others. And so we needed the board's assent to do that. And that was a separate process run by McCarthy Tétrault on behalf of the Attorney General.
I'm curious to find out what is happening for the funding for the companies with SDTC. We know that a lot of the companies were affected by the funding freeze. Is there a plan for resuming funding for these affected companies?
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, I will note when the Minister made his announcement in response to the Auditor General's findings, he did note that the plan is to get funding flowing again very quickly out to the clean tech ecosystem. Minister Champagne has been on record indicating his profound concern that clean tech companies have been caught in the crossfire as a result of this issue. That is a top priority for the new board that has been asked to take on responsibilities. So in effect, there are kind of 2 main responsibilities of the new board. One is get funding flowing again, but with all of the appropriate controls in place. And I said, as the continued holder of the contribution agreement, until such time as the NRC takes over, we will be applying all the enhanced controls in the management response and action plan. So effectively, until there's a new structure, the old structure prevails, and there's a new board that's been given very explicit instructions to up their game on oversight, and the department has significantly upped its oversight of the organization. Ultimately, this will be transferred to the NRC, and then it will be the NRC's job to be administering the funding. But in the short term, we do want to get funding restarted, but with a much greater level of probity and accountability, as per the recommendations of Ms. Hogan and the various reviews that have been done.
So the CIC, which is the new, corporation that combines CDTC and NRC's IRAP, is going to be established by 2026 to 27. That's a long time away.
So, Mr. Chair, what I would say is there's two things happening here, and I think it's important to distinguish the two.